So welcome everyone. We're in July already, halfway through the year, and we're back with our regular Impact Women's Network sessions. So we just had a pre-conversation about the point of these sessions is to get together and help us to think about things a little bit differently and go through some thought-provoking topics and think about what can we do as individuals and groups to make an impact on a wide range of topics, not just what we work on and with in a day-to-day basis. So anyone who doesn't know me, I think most people do, I'm Faye. I'm one of the co-founders with Shima. Hello, Shima. And the person who makes all this happen is Gemma, who is basically the coordinator of everything, promoter, and just gets us here every single month. So we have a range of topics that we go through each month, and the topics we've decided for 2021-22 are all about inter-resilience and, as I've said, how we can do things that are purposeful, that actually make a difference. And so we've been talking about sustainable impact, business model innovation, climate change, automation, a whole range of quite meaty topics. And today we have Dilrini De Silva with us. So some of you may already know Dilrini. Shima knows her from the past. Dilrini's been one of our 21 to watch candidates in the past as well. So we're absolutely thrilled to have Dilrini with us. And I think we should just get straight into it, Dilrini. So can I ask you to introduce yourself more formally and take us through your rather challenging questions, please?
Yes, absolutely. And thank you both Shima and Faye for inviting me to speak on this topic. And it's great to be here on a Wednesday morning, and thank you all for making it. Right, so I'm gonna, because I will talk a little bit about myself in my slides. So let me see if I can get this to work. So I think I need to share screen first, because I've got dual screen, so hopefully I'm going to share the right one with you. Can people see that now? Okay, and the pointer. Okay, so I can't see the pointer, so all right. Okay, there we go. Okay, yeah, so thanks again for inviting me, and I've purposely tried to keep my slides quite light because I didn't know what kind of audience we're to expect. So yeah, so first of all, a little bit about me. So I am a bioinformatics researcher by background and training. I did my PhD in population genetics in London, and then moved to worked in pathogen DNA sequencing and genomic epidemiology for a while in Oxford before moving to Cambridge to work in Cancer Research UK. And I worked on an ovarian cancer project during my time there. And most recently, as of January to June this year, I've been on secondment at AstraZeneca, and I've been working with one of the data sciences teams over there in how to look at how we can use artificial intelligence to accelerate some of their R&D processes when it comes to producing large numbers of their product in a relatively quicker time frame. So alongside this work, I'm also co-founder of a biotech startup in its very, very early stages. So sort of like at our ideation stage, let's say, and leading towards a proof of concept stage, and we're called Jana Bio. And the premise behind Jana Bio is about improving precision medicine or personalized treatment strategies for ethnic minority individuals. And this is because we see that ethnic minorities are usually in a clinical trial represented in less than 30% of the people who are enrolled in trials, like historically, like literally every trial that you look at, less than 30%. So this is kind of inching towards, so we've reached this number only quite recently, maybe in the last couple of years. But historically, they have been underrepresented. And this is the case even when a drug is being made for a population where, or being made for an indication for an indication which is actually at high prevalence in a minority population. So alongside that, even fewer individuals of non-Caucasian ancestry are represented in some of the largest genetic databases today. And these are genetic databases that get used for research as well as in drug development. So you can understand, I think you can understand that if we all know that if you use a biased data set, it's not really going to generalize well to multiple applications or to multiple populations. So behind this was our thinking of, okay, I think now is the time to start developing tools for the biopharma and the clinical community so that we can make personalized treatments based on genomics and proteomics quite relevant and more accessible to other populations. And this is not just talking about populations here in the UK, but this applies to people all over the world. So in a nutshell, that's kind of the background to what I'm doing right now. And so now it would be nice to know a bit more about you guys. So, we can make the most of this session. I was going to do a whiteboard, but I think we're just a few people today. So I think if the participants can just say who they are and what their background is in I guess 20 seconds, that would be really useful. So yeah, Pat.
Hi, I'm Pat Duckworth, and I specialize in helping women at menopause.
Oh, okay. Thank you. I can't see the names on the screens for the other two, actually.
And Petia, do you want to go next?
Yeah, so hi, I'm Petia, and I'm a structural engineer and researcher.
Oh, okay, thank you.
And Maria?
Maria. So I'm an engineer and I work in a research center. So I'm the manager of a group that takes care of digitalization of processes.
Okay, fantastic. Right.
Yeah.
All right. So engineering, women's health. Can I just say? Yeah. Okay. Great. All right. So totally not the usual audience that I'm used to. So this is going to be a challenge for me, but no, this is good. Okay, so I guess broadly, so in a sense, it's a good thing then that I decided to put in this slide to just describe what the drug development process looks like for someone who might not be familiar with this. So if you think of what happens in the very beginning, and this usually happens in academic labs. So most of the novel discoveries, they do happen in academic labs, but now a lot of pharma companies are doing their own R&D into novel therapeutics. And so this process is very much a long, laborious process, but a lot of computational techniques and artificial intelligence, machine learning is augmenting this part of the drug discovery process to make things go a lot faster. So when a company has identified, some molecules or some drugs that they think could have potential benefit, they move that into something called preclinical studies. And this is usually where all of your animal testing and everything happens to make sure that, to figure out what's the safe dosage that you might give to somebody. All of this happens in an animal and they just extrapolate that into what this might look like in humans. So you will be surprised. Even I didn't know that actually they only do animal testing in male animals. because female models are actually too complicated. It messes up their patterns, it messes up their data. There are hormonal changes that they have to take into account. So, you know, male animals are preferred. And so there is discussion now happening in the pharma industry, like, actually, this is not, we're not okay with this, because we really need to start, we've got someone else joining us as well. So, hi, Sayara. So, yeah, so this is actually, this discussion is taking place now. And so, yeah, so if you just think about, okay, why don't we factor in diversity in this whole process where you're trying to determine what's a good efficacious drug, what's a good safe drug, you're still performing all of these preclinical activities in male mouse models. So we're a bit further away from actually incorporating genetic diversity in human populations and capturing that in our preclinical pipelines. And so obviously at that point, you've identified a few more candidates that can go forward into the clinical phase. And the clinical phase is split up into 3 different phases. And in the first phase, so phase 1, you try out the drug on a few individuals, say 10, 50, less than 100 for sure. And then if, you know, your safety looks good, efficacy looks good in there, you then move on to phase 2, where you open this up to several hundred individuals. And phase 3 is when you kind of put that out more into the general public, and you might be doing multiple sites in different geographical locations. So now you're reaching thousands of patients. So generally in a clinical trial, like, you reach on average about 3,000 to 4,000 people before you you know, gather enough evidence and data about the safety and the efficacy, which then moves into FDA, or this is the Food and Drug Administration regulatory authority in the US, or the European Medicines Authority in Europe. And then your drug gets approved. So basically that process, it takes 10 to 12 years, maybe up to 15, and costs, you know, it's estimated that by the end, you've spent at least $1 billion just getting that one drug onto the market. So in terms of the number of compounds or drugs that you might be starting off with in your discovery phase, you might have like 10,000 drugs that you want to screen. And then by the time you're in preclinical, you're down to about 250, 100, in the hundreds if you're lucky. And then by the time you're in phase 3, you're probably testing 4 or 5 different drugs, and only one of them gets approved. So this is like this really narrow funnel effect happening there. And this is a laborious process. But during COVID, we've seen all of this happen within a year. And I think this is what we're, you know, one of the top, you know, major reasons to talk about this topic. So why was that possible? How was that possible? So I think with COVID, something we learned is that where there is a will, there's definitely a way. So if you want something to happen, you can make things happen, because we always think it's the system, it's just the way things work. But if you think about it, systems are people, and people can change systems. So what we learned from COVID is that collaboration is key. So there was a lot of sharing of data, sharing of ideas, especially how we saw like the genome sequence came out of a lab in Wuhan. They shared it immediately with the international scientific community, and they were like, the researchers were able to start building their mRNA vaccines against it almost immediately. So, and then we also saw that magic happens when funding priorities are aligned. So with this problem, with the COVID problem, science funding, pharmaceuticals, government priorities, they all aligned, they came together and said, okay, we're not doing anything else, we're going to do this, and this is our priority, and we're going to push things through. And a year later, we have a vaccine. And then I think one of the other more critical things that came out for the scientific community was that it demonstrated that basic science is still very important, because these mRNA vaccines, like the Pfizer vaccine, they came out of like years, like 5 to 10 years of actually trying to work on mRNA vaccines and thinking this might be the new paradigm for vaccine development. So those are some of the key things that we learned through this. Whoops, sorry. Yeah. And so I think one of the other things that really accelerated, as in made more people able to engage in clinical trials, is all of this remote, just like we're using Zoom and other collaboration tools, clinical trials have become really more accessible because people have thought, okay, we don't really have the mobility to screen people anymore, but maybe we can engage with them remotely. So, this has meant that we can take this forward and make sure that other clinical trials, we use the same technologies to reach patients that we couldn't reach before. So for instance, in cancer research, like a large proportion of patients don't have a trial accessible to them. So they don't live close to a major trial center. And we know, for instance, like in Cambridge, a lot of high class sort of world-leading trials happen in major centers like Cambridge, but how much of the population do we really reach in and around Cambridge for people to come and have to travel? So now is a time where we can start thinking about, okay, we don't have to be restricted about geographical location. Maybe we can make these trials more diverse as well. And the other major thing is that digital solutions have accelerated sort of trials mostly, but also all other aspects of the development process as well. So before, trials would happen with a lot of manual screening of forms and people filling in forms and trying to match up patients to what's happening, what they need, what their criteria is. So a lot of manual stuff, but I think a lot of companies, they have adopted this cloud-based infrastructure so that we can, so that they can track people effectively and then kind of look at all the pre-screening information, put this data together, analyze trends. So if people are dropping out, they're able to pick up on this and maybe adjust their criteria a little bit. And so you can quickly analyze stuff and update how you operate. And last of all, I think we've also seen that vaccines is not the same as vaccination. So there is a gap in how you go from having a product that is developed in record time and then getting that to people, getting that to the communities that need it the most. So I think there is a gap there. So, I mean, we are really fortunate here in the West to have reached very high levels of vaccinations in our populations. But in developing countries, as of now, only 1% of people have received at least one dose. So that's a lot of unvaccinated people. And if you also think about some of the issues related to that, sometimes it can come down to something as simple as packaging. For instance, if you think about the Pfizer vaccine, it requires cold storage. So you can't actually have one of these in your regular GP's office or in a pharmacy. You really need these special freezer packs, which are really, which can apparently only be opened once a day or twice a day, and then you can't use them anymore. So you really have to think that on the field, this is not practical. And I think one of the biggest lessons that companies have learned is that the moment you start developing your product, you really need to think, that's when you need to think about how it's going to be used at the end by the end user as well. So So this has also kind of, made people think about where do they do their manufacturing, and thought, have to think about where do you actually have it in one geographical location, or do you now have to think about having multiple geographic locations to do manufacturing? Because we've seen that transport was a big issue, like shipping stuff from one place to another was a big issue during COVID. So these are some of the things that have come out of this. And finally, before we kind of open to discussion, I think the last thing I'd like to really mention here is about how companies have started to think about their market access and IP strategies, and how these two things go hand in hand. So when we think about market access, what that means is every eligible patient for a drug should have rapid and sustained access to it where it's necessary. So, so then you have to also think about, a company's IP strategy, because maybe the IP strategy determines that we're not going to give out any manufacturing licenses to our distributors or to our manufacturing partners. We're going to keep the manufacturing IP to ourselves, and then we're going to work with distributors. So, I think, how does that really work with getting access to some of the poorest countries? So at this point, I mean, this is not, I was hoping we'd have, like a legal person on the call today, because this is something I don't know too much about myself and would like to learn a little bit more. So I came across this, I guess this is being talked about these days because of the COVID situation as well, how there is this something called the TRIPS agreement, which is enacted by the members of the World Trade Organization. And this is essentially an agreement that dictates intellectual property or IP rights when you're dealing with products that can be patentable across borders. So this determines, so because pharmaceutical products are patentable, so they come under this agreement. So you have a lot of IP protection, and the nations that subscribe to this, they really enforce this very strongly. So there was this there was this debate about, okay, actually this is really disadvantaging developing countries. So so then there was something called the Doha Declaration on the TRIPS agreement, and this so here they kind of reinterpreted these laws to say, well, this agreement should not really restrain protecting public health. So if there is a public health need, governments have this option of doing something called a compulsory licensing. So here, governments are licensed to use certain products without the permission of the patent holder. So without the permission of the pharma company actually handing over IP rights, or them coming into some sort of licensing deal. And this is, there are pros and cons to this. I think some, the companies are not too happy about it. Governments are not too happy about it because they have to deal with this. But this is something that is currently being talked about in the context of COVID, because some of the countries are asking for a waiver of this TRIPS agreement so that they can start manufacturing vaccines themselves. So I think these are some of the kind of just ideas that I just put out there that we can kind of talk about in the context of in this session where we are going to. The plan was we would discuss these 3 topics in breakout rooms, but maybe because it's just us, we might just go through each topic one by one, and think about how some of the things I've just mentioned can be applied in other settings for other diseases, in how we can improve diversity in data sets now that we have all of this technology at hand. How can we get other advanced therapies into developing countries. There are issues around manufacturing, IP, and how market access can actually work in a way that the pricing is right. And then also how AI and digital technologies, we don't propagate biases we've had in the past in kind of opening up to this new era of drug development and delivery. So yeah, so with that, I'd like to kind of open the floor to discussion and and any comments really. I know there's at least one person here who's got some sort of digital background, so maybe you can weigh in on that.
I think, Dilrini, just observations first of all to get us going. I thought it would be way less than 30% as well, going right back to the beginning. So some of those things are a challenge, but you just don't, as a normal human being, not saying that others are not normal. Mm-hmm. The fact if the developers of drugs had thought about the execution and deployment of them, mm-hmm. That really should have changed, some of the outputs. It's great where we are, but I just think it's been really interesting to have got a view of generally drug development. So I do appreciate that. I see Pat's got her hand up.
From the world of menopause, and there are, I recognize some of the issues here because firstly, there are different issues from different racial backgrounds around menopause. So for example, Afro-Caribbean women have more incidence of uterine fibroids, and they end up having more hysterectomies because treatments aren't really being developed to deal with the fibroids, rather than just saying, well, we will just do a hysterectomy and that solves the problem. So that's not talked about much, and it's not really seen as an issue because the solution is, well, we do a hysterectomy, even though that is really the radical solution to a health problem. So I think, that comes immediately to mind. I don't know what other issues there are that are very specific to different ethnicities. The other thing is, of course, because menopause is a women's issue, it sort of falls right into this, that drugs are tested on male mice. And, so much testing is done in the male population rather than the female, because the female is more complicated and women end up with drugs that weren't designed for them, that don't fit in with their cycles anyway. So I think that is a really important issue. And then we've got the issue of, like with menopause and HRT, is the cost of it. That because this is something you might have to take for a number of years, and women have to pay for it, is that equitable? It might be equal in that men have to pay for stuff too, but is it equitable in that women might need a bit more resources just to get through this stage of life? So I think there are a number of issues that I see just in that realm of menopause, which makes this really interesting. Oh, final point, of course, a lot of women end up being given antidepressants for menopause when antidepressants aren't licensed for menopause, but it's easy to give them. That's just my view. Anyway, thank you. Very interesting, Dilrini.
I didn't know that, actually. Yeah. That's depressing just hearing about it.
It depresses me just knowing so many women are on antidepressants.
Yeah, no, that's true. And Faye, to your for a previous point that, okay, 30% was higher than you thought it would be. So if you look at so this is on average, because there were certain trials which had a significant number, and this was only as recent as 2019, 2018. So in previous years, like in the previous decade, it's been in the single digits. So yeah, so this thing, relatively new increase is because trials have now started recruiting more people of East Asian, so of Chinese ancestry and so on. So because a lot of the trials still happen in the US, and we're still not seeing, I think, say the Black population in America is still not being represented for the indications that actually apply to these populations in a much higher frequency than it would normally.
So is it, Dilrini, is it, in answer to your first question, is it a marketing issue? Are we just not reaching the right people using the right channels, or do we just, it's my lack of understanding as to how you go and get people to participate in a clinical trial. Are we just approaching them the wrong way?
I think so. I think there are several layers to that problem. I think looking at the history of trials in the US, there's a lot of mistrust amongst these populations because they've been exploited in a way. So I don't know if people are aware of the Henrietta Lacks issue. So this actually really came to the forefront of discussion last year during the Black Lives Matter movement, because again, it's not something I knew until I started working in ovarian cancer and so on, that a lot of the cell lines, like the cancer cell lines that we use for testing drugs, have people heard of the HeLa cell line? Okay, so the HeLa cell line, at least in the cancer field, it's like it's this cell line which you can grow, this immortalized cell line essentially, which is one of the standard lines used in screening cancer drugs, anti-cancer drugs. And it turns out this cell line was actually was from a Black woman who had ovarian cancer, taken without her consent in the 1950s. So this was at Johns Hopkins University Hospital. And this is when, and actually that was during a time when Johns Hopkins was one of the only hospitals that would treat Black people. So this is quite recent. So there was obviously lack of access to proper medical care for people from this community, but also they were not told that actually we're going to harvest your cells and start doing tests on them in the labs. And this cell line has gone on to generate billions of revenue for the companies that started producing this, right? And lots of patents have been created because of this, but there was no attribution to the donor, the donor of this cell line. And so there's been lots of litigation around it because the family is now aware that actually it was our mother's cells that gave rise to all of these new discoveries and patents and stuff, but they never received any form of compensation, or I don't know if they were looking for compensation, but acknowledgement. And so there was a book, a couple of books written about this. So because of history like that, some communities could be distrustful, right? So they could say, well, you're trying to experiment on us. So there is that at the back of their minds as well. And the other thing is, again, access. So say if you are leading a cancer trial, you might be doing this cancer trial in one of the bigger institutions, let's say Johns Hopkins again, or Cambridge, or whatever it is, or Harvard Medical School, or whatever. I mean, a lot of people, like somebody from this community, their GP or gynecologist or their oncologist will most likely not be from one of these institutions and not have access to refer someone onto a clinical trial. So most doctors will refer their patients onto a trial if they feel that they will benefit from being on a trial. So it's, again, how do we break that barrier? maybe you definitely need another way of recruiting people, and this should come by having more connections with the community leaders, perhaps, to actually start talking about, actually, this can be beneficial for your community. So I know of at least one startup here in London, in the UK, that is led by women, by the way, and they are really starting to reach out to community leaders and educate them, bring awareness around trials, about research studies and so on, and really try and connect that community so that people, both the companies kind of doing their research and the academic institutions and the communities can benefit from this. So yeah, so long answer is that it's a multifaceted problem, but yeah, it's not without solutions, I think.
Yeah, I mean, it's hugely interesting, isn't it? The whole I mean, anyone would do that. Or you just experimenting on us. So it is that raising that level of awareness, isn't it? And having accountability to go and talk to an array of people. It shouldn't just be the same. Pat, is that as they say, the legacy hand, or are you coming back in? If anyone wants to jump in, please do jump in. Don't worry about raising your hands. We're small enough.
Yeah, exactly.
Sorry, that was a legacy hand.
One of the things that surprised me, yesterday I was reading in the newspaper from Spain, El País, that only 4% of the studies about COVID included the gender as a variable. And what it surprised me is that this discussion about how women and minority has been represented in research for medical trials is happening in the past few years. Yeah, it's probably at least 2 or 3 years that I've been listening more and more about it. Mm-hmm. And then COVID hit, and I don't know, probably my expectation was that this is the time to involve everyone. And then it's surprising to see like what I was reading yesterday. So it was genetic about COVID studies, not particularly only for vaccines, but talking that even today in the latest studies, still only a very small percentage of those studies worldwide are using sex as a variable.
Yeah, I think you're right. I think in the beginning, when they started the trials on COVID and started recording information, they also didn't record ethnicity, right? This was not a requirement. And yeah, I'm surprised to hear that gender wasn't, a variable that was taken into account as well. So sometimes I wonder, like, why do people design studies this way? I mean, I don't design clinical studies or trials, but is there a reason for doing that, or is it just because it's easier, like to get approval, just to analyze the data? I don't know. I think it's just that they don't really think about that. Maybe there should be some pressure then from the regulatory standpoint to say, actually, we need to see the data for all these categories before we can approve you for marketing authorization. So maybe that is one way where regulators can have a say in this.
I mean, I think that's hugely interesting, isn't it? So the regulators they just want to have the percentage, or they don't mind where that data's come from. Surely there should be something that says you've covered an array of different people. Otherwise, we know that a solution works really well on, white 24-year-old men. Yeah. Do you know what I mean? It's just crazy.
Yeah.
I think it is just easier because women's cycles are more complicated, that they've just tended to focus on men because it's easier. It doesn't mean that women get the right medication, it just means it's easier for the drug company.
Okay.
Yeah, it blows my mind, actually. And I think, yeah, I think it's just, I mean, I don't know. I think these so at least during my brief stint at AZ in the last few months, I did have a few discussions with people who are in the sort of R&D side of things, and it's only now that they're really talking about, okay, maybe we need to include female mouse models in our work, and they're kind of having that conversation about where do we get the funding internally to make that happen, and what do we need to put in place to start analyzing data in that way. So I think as commercial entities, they just want the quickest route to get to market. But I think there's pressure now from society in general. I think people are being more open and talking about this and holding, let's not say shaming drug companies, but trying to say, actually, you can't be business as usual anymore. You have to take these things into account. So hopefully there will be some form of change, happening slowly but surely.
Yeah, I also keep reading now about the growth in Femtech industries. Mm-hmm. And I wonder if that's going to put pressure. I think there's this recognition now, probably among younger women, of wanting to understand their cycles more and their performance more, and even their reproductivity. I don't know if that's a word. Their fertility. Let's use that. They're understanding their fertility more, and this seems to be developing apps and various ways, various technical ways of tracking it. And I just wonder if that's going to put more pressure on the drug companies as well.
Yeah, and even, I mean, what Dilrini is doing here, it's, it is a very early stage startup, but you've got half a dozen people on this call that are going to go away and say, did you actually know this was happening? So it is that snowball effect as well. So I want to, in the interest of time, I want to try and move on to the other. I know we're kind of still on the first one. Views on affordability of drugs. We've seen in COVID, it can happen. Drug companies can do things not for profit. I'm not sure that that's going to continue for everything, but how do we make sure that it is equitable around the world and we get through? It's pointless having some countries less than 1% vaccinated. Otherwise, what is the point of it all? So what are people's views on question number 2?
I thought it was interesting that AstraZeneca took such a PR hit, and it did make me wonder whether it was the big drug companies who weren't happy that AstraZeneca was saying, well, we're going to make this like not for profit, we just want to get this out there, and the other drug companies then all kind of piled in criticizing AstraZeneca. So it did make you wonder if there was a bit of a thing going on in the background, that they're trying to protect their profits, and we know how expensive it is to develop drugs, and obviously drug companies want to be incentivized to carry on doing research and producing them. So I think that is really the challenge. How do they stay incentivized, and how do they become more equitable in producing them?
Yeah, yeah, I think that's the challenge, like finding that balance, like how do you protect your products, but also make sure that people who are supposed to get it, who need it the most, also get it. And here, I think companies in the past, I think especially with like HIV, TB, malarial drugs, they have had situations where you have one price for high-income countries, and then you have sort of tiered pricing for other countries depending on their GDP or purchasing power or whatever it is. So they kind of work that into their strategy for market access, and perhaps this is something they can do with other drugs as well, especially when we think of cancer drugs. I mean, I always talk about, from the cancer perspective, but, cancer drugs are so expensive, and being a chronic condition, you're kind of taking them for years at a time. And this in a developing country, I mean, that's really not affordable when you think about it. And now we're talking about more advanced therapies in the West, like cell therapy or gene therapy as cancer treatments, and immunotherapies as cancer treatments. And these are all very expensive, even in the Western context. So what I'm seeing happening now in that area is that countries like India, with large manufacturing capacities for pharmaceuticals, they are taking, so they're assuming a leadership role in this and saying, actually, yeah, we're no longer going to be the pharmacy of the global South or the world, but we're going to be an R&D center as well, because we want to be able to develop our own drugs, not just take stuff that's off patent and produce them in the millions. So I think there's a shift change in this happening. We've seen that, especially again, asking for that waiver of the IP protection for the COVID vaccines. India, I think it was South Africa, India, and Brazil that kind of led this request to the member states to say, actually, we need a waiver because we can start producing for our own populations. And this is still in discussion. So this is, I think this came up in April of this year, and this is still under discussion. There's a lot of opposition, naturally from most of the Western countries about this. Lots of reasons as to why. I mean, I'm not too familiar, I don't have an in-depth view of this, but I think moving forward, countries like India will not take a back seat, I don't think, when it comes to developing new therapies.
Yeah, it's like I'm a born optimist, as most people will know, but like working from home and efficient and how we return to work and things like that, are we going to go back into our bad habits of the past? And it kind of feels the same here. Is there not something that can be done that keeps drug development, inclusive drug development, in a more collaborative way? Or is that a pipe dream? Is anyone actually trying to pursue that, or will we just go back to the way pharmaceutical companies have run forever?
Well, hopefully not is the answer. But I think they can't go back to how things were. I mean, things are opening up. More people are getting involved in the conversations. People are becoming more aware. I think there will be individuals and communities that will hold them to account going forward. I don't think they can go back to how things were. They will challenge it, and I think there will be smaller companies, and from the biotech sector, especially from the startups and SME sector, that will come to challenge these paradigms, and they will have to change and take that into account.
Yeah. And then your last question, quite quickly, then, was on digital adoption. AI.
So here I think digital adoption. So again, in the context of saying, okay, we have this app or this tool that's going to make taking part in a clinical trial super easy and fast. You don't have to travel anywhere. But I think something we forget is that me thinking about maybe reaching a rural community or a community that is not based around a major trial center. this might be in a different geographic location. Yes, we have developed these tools, but do we know if these people have access to, reliable access to the internet, for instance, or reliable access to a network provider that, is affordable for them to actually start a video call with somebody living thousands of miles away? Because especially in the developing country context, I mean, I read somewhere that they had asked this little girl in this village, so what does being wealthy mean to you, or what does being rich mean to you? And her answer was like, oh, to be able to take a video call on WhatsApp without thinking about how much it's going to cost. That is their level of, we don't even think about it. We're on Zoom because, hey, I have a broadband connection at home, and I can join a call anywhere, anytime. I know it's going to be reliable. So, things like that we really don't think about when we are designing something for a population. We assume that our experiences are going to be reflected in that. So how do we bring more of that thinking into your design stage? Rather than saying here's the product, now it's somebody else's problem to kind of implement it on the ground. So there's going to have to be more transparency between these things going forward, I think. Any other sort of thoughts, perhaps? I don't know, I guess from the engineering perspective around digital, whether there are any parallels you can draw and lessons that you can transfer.
I completely agree with Dilrini that sometimes we forget that people not necessarily have all digital equipment and internet connection and everything. And depending on what is our target audience, our target population, we need to develop customized solutions for this. And I know that in some countries, people pay for kilobytes for the internet connection. Even if this country is not necessarily very developing world, they're in the middle, they're kind of emerging economies, but still a lot of people in rural areas, especially, they pay for the kilobytes, and that's why they can't afford a lot of browsing or a lot of video calls or anything else. And yes, I think you're very right. Basically, just I can't add anything. I just want to support what you're saying, and definitely. And very often people just completely forget that internet not for everyone.
Yeah. Dilrini, thank you. I think you've raised more questions for everyone on the call than we've probably given you insights and answers on. But it's definitely a topic I think we should be engaged with and probably re-engage with in due course as well. So huge